Okay, I'm starting recording. So basically, the previous design vision that we had for Duo Workflow, it was mostly focused on complicated and deterministic workflows. So if I, try to fix a pipeline, it is going to create a comprehensive plan for me with many things that it's hoping to do, and you were able to review it. And if you really want to understand how it goes from point one or A to Z in completing this workflow, it's helpful to have this transparency. But then once you run all of this, let me see if I can speed it up. I don't know if I can speed it up. I want to see if I can speed it up. But basically, at the end of this, there's an execution that continues, and there's even like a progress bar, right? As you can see here, that at the very end, the workflow completes. It's done. And this is, I think, helpful for these, again, deterministic workflows where we know where things start and when things finish. But for other kinds of workflows where you just want to explore something, or even, and you don't know where it's going to end, or even a small workflow and a small, goal that you have that, you don't need to see a whole like big plan. You just wanted to get it done. And maybe it's even something that Duo can do reliably. So here we see the execution complete state. It's a very close, like it's okay, it's done. You have to close the workflow, and yeah, that's it. So what I was thinking was three different approaches. So trying to design a more flexible user experience for this, and three different kinds of workflows. One being the more exploratory, which is this part at the top here. This one in the middle, which is I don't even know if this word exists, the automatable workflow, but it's a workflow where it's small enough and it's reliable enough that Duo can do almost all of it without user oversight, and maybe only at the end they need to approve whatever it did. And then finally, this detailed plan, which is essentially what we were looking at here. So the most simple one, which is the automatable workflow, is you ask Duo, and this could happen. I'm using the chat here as the trigger, but you could think about this also, especially for these kinds of workflows that are very easy to automate, and it's very reliable for us to automate. We could potentially even have just buttons in the UI. Like in this case, it says like upgrade project dependencies. Instead of asking in the chat for this, which you could do, we could also have a button in the regular web UI near your dependencies file or something like that, where you could just click, check for dependency updates or something like that, and it would do all of this work behind the scenes for you. But in this case, it's using the chat. And so in this case, if I just want to upgrade my project dependencies, this is a workflow that from the research we did, the vast majority of the research participants were comfortable with AI doing all of it up to the point of approval. So in this case, AI would just give you a summary of what it's proposing to do. It's going to check for outdated dependencies, verify them, validate, and create a merge request to review. So you can just click create merge request, and that's it. Or if you want to see it in more detail and maybe even tweak exactly what it's going to do, you could just click review plan, which would open up the workflow view with all of the steps and what it's going to do, and you could tweak it. So this is the very straightforward. The other one, which is again very similar to what I was showing before, is you ask it to fix the latest pipeline. And because that is a much more complicated and involved workflow, it's going to give you a summary here in the chat, but then it requires you to review, adjust if needed, and start the plan on this workflow view, where maybe, and this is something that we still have to explore, is also what kind of automation level you are comfortable with for this specific workflow. And maybe that's even something we can set at the user level for all workflows and all kinds of automation for Duo. If it's something that you're comfortable with just suggesting and you have to approve the changes, if Duo can make the changes itself, if it can even publish on your behalf, or if you want granular control over specific features that Duo can use and how it can use them. But here the thinking is the same as what we saw in the other design vision, is that you would have a plan from start to finish. You can add steps, you can remove them, edit them, and then you can start the plan, and it would start the execution, with whatever automation level you seek, basically. And all of this is fine for the deterministic workflows, but what about the situations where you're creating a proof of concept? The user themselves are not sure what they want to do, right? Where does it end? Maybe they just want to keep exploring and they don't want a heavy workflow like that is complete and it finishes, and then they every time they want to do more things, they have to start a new workflow and then complete and start a new workflow. So they just want to keep going. So extending that experience, this is not necessarily part of the scope or whatever, but I was just thinking that it would be interesting when Duo has more capabilities that we could categorize and show more examples in the empty state. But anyway, jumping from this to this point where the user has asked a question about a specific technical approach, whatever it is, and one of the suggestions is to, sorry, actually this is wrong, build an example app with that approach, right? So this would be one of the suggested follow-ups. And as a user, I click here and Duo is going to do just that. So it's going to, in this case, with a more suggested approach, it's not making any changes. It summarizes the changes that could be made to build an example app with that approach. It lists the files that it's touching and that it's suggesting changes, and even commands if you want, if you need to install certain dependencies or run other things that need the command line. And from here, you can, again, this is like the suggested automation level where it's not making any changes. If you tweak this and say, oh, actually make all of the changes, it wouldn't ask permission to apply any of these commands or changes, or even this command, this button that says apply all. It would just go and apply everything autonomously. But in this case, as you can see here, the plan, we now have like a diff view for this particular file and what Duo is proposing to add. And we have just one step, which is build prototype, for example, app. But once we inspect the changes and even what the command is going to do, and we apply them, we can see in the next step that the changes have been applied. We have the check marks here. We have this timeline view that says exactly what happens. So Duo edited these files and installed these dependencies, and then asks, do the changes match your requirements? And if not, you can say what you want to see differently, and this is the opportunity to iterate. Or when you say it looks good, it marks this step of building a prototype, for example, app, as complete. So this is the next part. So it's marked as complete. And it says here in the timeline, build prototype, for example, app completed just now. You have the ability to revert to previous state and revert all of those changes. But then you can continue the discussion, asking more changes, asking for questions, or manually adding steps here of what you want to see done. So imagine I want, okay, now for this example app, add authentication, and also add the ability for two-factor authentication, and also add a feedback form for my app, whatever. So you can also build your plan in advance, or you can build it as you build whatever it is you're doing, or editing whatever it is you're editing. And throughout all of this, here we're just seeing one step, and I didn't design more screens, but you can imagine that every time you're asking for revisions to what Duo is suggesting, we can have different versions of the suggested changes. So I can go back and forth and see the other versions of what Duo has suggested. So you basically keep track of the history of the workflow throughout steps and throughout revisions of these artifacts that it is changing, in the same way that you would work with the calling and they're making suggestions and you're accepting it and so on. So yeah, this is something I shared with the team yesterday, and they had, both praise and questions, right? And also, especially being an engineering audience, you can imagine the feasibility questions that were coming to mind. But this is also more in line with how we're seeing users interact with tools like this in the day-to-day to explore and just work with AI in all different ways. So yeah, that's what I wanted to share. Let me stop recording now.